For many people who perhaps have either been in the gallery or listening online to the last couple of hours, they may well wonder just what on earth this is all about. So I will talk a little bit about the context of this morning and the context of this bill that we are currently debating. But I will also talk about why the Coalition has concerns about the bill as presented by the government in response to the situation with the CFMEU, and talk about why the actions of the CFMEU are bad for my home state of South Australia, for taxpayers, for small business people, and indeed even for workers in the construction industry, and why the Coalition believe that this bill does need to include measures around a minimum term for any administration that is put in place, as well as transparency to make sure that this parliament, on behalf of taxpayers and those people who are affected by the actions of militant unions such as this, can be scrutinised, but also to the topic that has absorbed the chamber for all of this morning, which is if we genuinely believe that the actions of a union under its current leadership, even though Mr Secker has left, are illegal and toxic and not in the best interests of Australia, then why would parties not either return funding or commit to not taking funding, and that includes both the Greens and the government? I can almost guarantee they've never donated to the Coalition into the future. So why is there an issue? Well, for people who have been following this, this has been an issue around for a long time, but the most recent trigger probably started off with the bullying behaviour we saw from Mr Secker and the CFMEU over football umpiring, of all things. And people would ask, well, what has football umpiring got to do with the debate we've just had here in the chamber? Well, people may recall that under the Coalition government we established a watchdog to make sure that the militancy and illegal activities of the CFMEU and other militant unions acting in that construction sector were actually held to account. And it was such a bitter relationship between Mr Secker and those in the Building Construction Commission that when the former head, Mr Stephen McBurney, who was involved with AFL football umpiring, was appointed by the AFL to have a leadership role in their football umpiring, Mr Secker said that the unions would target all of the construction programs that were associated with the AFL. Now, on one hand, you could say, well, why should the broader public care? Well, partly because football leagues are largely funded by memberships, mums and dads, small sponsors, the taxpayer. You look at the debate around a stadium in Tasmania where the taxpayers are putting up funding, and you look at the evidence that has come forward over a number of years about the cost premium, 10, 20, up to 30%, across a range of areas once the CFMEU decide that they're going to take action on or against those projects. And so I think it was the public response to something as inane as Mr Secker having a personal dislike of Mr McBurney that flowed out, in the Australian public and media highlighted that this kind of bullying behaviour and the cost it would then impose on community was not good, but it also highlighted the unwillingness of the Prime Minister and his senior ministers to send a forceful message to Mr Secker and the CFMEU that would say this kind of behaviour that divides our society is just not appropriate. And we've seen this weak leadership on display from everything from the immigration disasters that my colleague Senator Patterson here has prosecuted so successfully, where the Prime Minister has been unwilling to intervene, let alone sack a minister who has caused so much disruption by the release of criminals into our society, right through to issues around the Middle East and how our society has been divided because of a lack of moral clarity and leadership about what is acceptable in this country. Regardless of your views of what happens overseas, the Prime Minister has been weak on setting clear boundaries and standards as to what is acceptable in this country. But following the football incident, the thing that probably pushed the government into acting was the revelations by the Australian Financial Review and others that underworld figures, including bikie gangs, had infiltrated the CFMEU's ranks and had adopted positions of leadership. And this potentially explains the illegal behaviour, and indeed documents in the federal court claim that the CFMEU has breached workplace laws some 2,600 times over 20 years and accumulated more than $24 million in fines. Some 213 of the court cases resulted in total penalties of that $24 million, plus at least $4 million ordered against particular office holders, employees, delegates and members. Now, you would think that those actions would be enough to dissuade wrongdoing. But what it highlights is that those financial penalties are not enough to dissuade a group like the CFMEU because, A, the total that they can extort from industry far exceeds the fines and the power and control that is given to them. And what then results is, the old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that for an organisation that is actually set up on paper to be for the benefits of its workers, what we see, like many totalitarian regimes, is that it's actually to benefit the senior leadership and to enhance their power base, and that's why we see manufacturing division members, for example, of the same union being intimidated and harassed and bullied by the construction division simply because they're in a different part of the union that doesn't bow the knee as much as people in the construction sector. And we heard evidence here from my colleague Senator Scarr about some of the actions that have been taken against people who've turned up to a workplace just wearing the wrong T-shirt, which alleges loyalty or fealty to a union other than the CFMEU and Mr Setka, where people were driven to the point of taking their own life. Mr Setka has even been recorded on video of intimidating the leaders of other parts of the union, highlighting that they know where they live and that they can be affected if there is not loyalty to that union. So, long story short, the government has come up against what we would call a boundary, where they go, the Australian public are not going to accept this because of bullying and illegal behaviour, and particularly involving the underworld. We need to do something about it. Now, for many of you, my former career was as an experimental test pilot, and there's a condition that we try and avoid in aircraft design where a pilot can induce an oscillation, but some of them, some pilot-induced oscillations, are caused by what we call boundary avoidance. You suddenly realise that you're flying far too close to an obstacle, you're approaching the ground more quickly, and you instinctively react and you jerk the controls, and then you overcorrect, and before you know it, you get into this big porpoising movement that is unsafe. Well, to some extent, that's what we've seen here with the government rushing to bring in this bill. They've rushed to bring in this legislation without adopting the normal processes of the Senate. And so one of the objections that the Coalition has is that the reason we have a House of Review and the committee system is so that rather than having knee-jerk reactions that put forward a bill that may well have unintended consequences, or it may not actually achieve the outcomes that are intended, and I'm just giving benefit of the doubt there that the intention is good, or worst case, if there is a commitment to do something purely to avoid the public criticism, but the structure of the legislation is not going to achieve the intended outcome that is being put forward to the public as the intended actions of the government, then the role of the Senate is to engage with stakeholders, legal professionals, others, to go, will this bill address the problem? Will it actually have the outcome that we're looking for? Or are there unintended consequences that will actually make matters worse? And so one of the strengths of this Senate is to have the committee process where we can scrutinise legislation, and where there is a time frame, that can be done quickly. I have sat on committees before that have had very limited time, looking to ask for submissions, considering submissions, holding hearings and then reporting within a week. But it adds value to the whole process, and it means the laws that are passed by this parliament are actually effective. And so the sort of things that we are concerned about is that if we have laws that don't actually hold the CFMEU to account, if we have laws that enable the executive government to establish or disestablish at will, if there are no terms for the length of an administration, for example in this case, if there are elements of the CFMEU in terms of branches that are not covered, or if the actions of an administrator are not open to scrutiny by the parliament. So, for example, mechanisms the Senate has, such as Senate estimates, where we get to evaluate whether or not an appointed authority, whether that be a department or an agency, or in this case an administrator, is actually implementing what the public and the elected representatives in the Senate expect the body to be doing and are being effective in their role, then it's almost worse than appointing them in the first place, because people assume they're doing the right thing, but without that transparency mechanism, nobody would know. And for a government that was elected on a platform of transparency and accountability, it is truly shocking the number of times that this government has sought to frustrate measures to put in place transparency and accountability for their actions or the actions of bodies that they wish to appoint. And to the last point again around the funding, if we genuinely believe that these are essentially proceeds of crime, the money that the CFMEU has in its coffers have come about because of actions that have seen them face numerous fines and other convictions, then on what basis can any party of government, or indeed any party of protest, being the Labor Party and the Greens respectively, actually refuse to commit to taking funding from such a body? So there's a number of areas, and I'm aware that there have been discussions between the coalition and the government where we have closed the gap. The government has ceded in a number of these places. But the whole purpose of the Senate is to have the inquiry so that we can lay out for the public whether legislation will be fit for purpose. We can propose amendments, which then, rather than doing in backroom deals, are done through the process of debate, informed inquiry and amendments moved in this chamber, which again is part of transparency, which is for the best interest of the Australian people. And so, Mr Deputy President, I cannot support this legislation unamended by the amendments proposed by the coalition.